At the beginning of the 20th century, Great Britain was primarily interested in Iran for two specific reasons. One, access to its strategic oil resources to fuel Britain's navy and economy. And second, to act as a buffer zone against Russia to protect its Indian empire. And hence it was in Britain's interests to have a local Iranian administration that was compliant with Britain's interests. Hi, you're listening to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we continue tracing the history of Iran after the abdication of Reza Shah Pahlavi. Following the occupation of the Iranian throne by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, on January 29, 1942, a tripartite treaty of alliance was signed between Iran, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. This treaty essentially placed Iran under the temporary occupation of the Allied forces during World War II, with a promise to withdraw 6 months after the end of World War II. And Iran agreed to provide logistical support, communications, and transport facilities to the Allies during the war. And as we said in the previous episode, the primary reason for the abdication of Reza Shah Pahlavi and this temporary occupation of Iran during World War II was to ensure that the Iranian oil did not land in the hands of the Germans. Oil, though, continued to be a bone of contention between Iran and the British, ultimately laying the groundwork for the Cultural Revolution and the toppling of the monarchy in 1979. It was in May of 1901 that Muzaffaruddin Shah of the Qajar dynasty granted the British subject William K. D'Arcy a 60-year oil concession on all areas of Iran except the 5 northern provinces bordering Russia. Concession meaning the British had exclusive privilege to explore, exploit, and export petroleum. Oil was discovered in commercial quantities in southwest Iran in late May 1908, and subsequently the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was now Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, was formed in London in April 1909. So technically, the British oil industry was created on the edifice of the Iranian oil infrastructure. In 1914, a contract was signed between the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and the British government, under which the Anglo-Persian Oil Company guaranteed uninterrupted supply of oil to the British government for 30 years at fixed prices. Iranians were not happy about this deal, and while the Qajars were still in power, Iran reopened the door on negotiations with respect to royalty payments to the Iranian government, and in December of 1920, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company paid £1 million in settlement of Iran's claims on royalties. Under the original DRC concessions, Anglo-Persian Oil Company was supposed to pay 16% of net profits to the Persian government. And this £1 million payment was essentially resolving the outstanding royalty payments owed to Iran. And once Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power in late 1925, talks to revise the concession were restarted in London in July of 1928. And Reza Shah Pahlavi's core contention was that the 1920 agreement was not legal because it had never passed the Majlis. Then in November of 1932, Reza Shah Pahlavi did the unthinkable. He cancelled the DRC concession while stating that Iran would not refuse to grant a new concession to the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. There was high drama as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and the British took this dispute to the League of Nations. But Iran was not just randomly looking to create a controversy around the concessions. They were looking ahead and wanted some specific areas to be addressed by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. First was the issue of royalties, and Iran wanted a guarantee with respect to royalty payments. The second was that Iran wanted some representation on the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's board because they were concerned about the British influence on the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The third, they wanted some investment in the technical training of the local Iranians so that there was more representation of the local populace in the company's operations. And the other, which really alarmed the British government, was the reduction of the area that Anglo-Persian Oil Company could exploit to just 100,000 square miles. The Iranians were looking to diversify the exploitation of oil within their country, so it was not just one monopoly with exclusive rights on the Iranian oil. And this is what scared the British, because if other countries, notably the Germans, gained access to Iranian oil, their supplies could be impacted, and most importantly, the Germans would get direct access to oil. Ironically, though, the concession was initially offered to the Americans, not the Germans. But the Americans notified the Iranians that they were busy with their concessions in the Arab world, so did not have any interest in Iranian oil. So when the Germans came in, the British intervened, and Reza Shah Pahlavi was forced to abdicate. So with a foreign power clearly manipulating the politics within Iran, a wave of nationalism emerged within Iran. And soon after the war, a loose coalition of nationalists, clerics, and non-communist left-wing parties, known as the National Front, coalesced under the leadership of Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a career politician and a lawyer, and he ran on the platform of reducing the powers of the monarchy and clergy in Iran, and most importantly, regaining control of Iran's natural oil resources, notably oil. So in 1951, when Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister, he followed through on his plans and nationalized the Iranian oil industry. And as a result, the National Iranian Oil Company was formed. And with this act, Mohammad Mossadegh became immensely popular in Iran. So much so that in 1952, he was named Time magazine's Man of the Year. As expected, the British were not happy with the developments and took the case of the nationalization of Iran's oil industry to the United Nations Security Council. Mossadegh himself appeared before the UN Security Council and made a very successful presentation demonstrating that Britain's oil profits in 1950 alone were more than what it paid Iran during the previous half-century. The British also took their case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Once again, Mossadegh argued on behalf of Iran, and in July of 1952, the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of Iran, stating that it lacked jurisdiction because the dispute was between a sovereign government and a private company. And this was followed by the UN Security Council decision rejecting the British complaint against Iran. But having lost control of oil, the British were fighting Iran on several fronts. An economic embargo had been placed on Iranian oil, and subversive activities conducted by foreign agents were visible on Iranian streets. To quell these subversive activities, Mohammad Mossadegh requested the Shah for control of the armed forces, but he was refused, and subsequently, Mossadegh resigned as prime minister. The Shah happily accepted his resignation and appointed Ahmad Ghavam as prime minister. But there were massive street protests in Iran in July of 1952. And that is when the Shah saw firsthand the people's support for Mossadegh. Alarmed by these developments, the Shah immediately changed course and reappointed Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister, making him also the Minister of Defense as permitted by the Constitution. One of the key highlights of Mohammad Mossadegh's short tenure was that he fostered a sense of self-sufficiency within Iran, so much so that he refused concessions to the Soviet Union as well. Production was improved in non-oil industries. Many social reforms were implemented, but his policies were frequently opposed by the Shah, the leading clerics, landowners, and the governments of Britain and the United States. Exhausted with their futile attempts to destabilize Iran, the British, working jointly with the CIA, drafted a plan codenamed Operation Ajax to overthrow Mossadegh from power. On August 15, 1953, the plan went into action, but Mossadegh had already been tipped off and the attempted coup failed miserably. The Shah was scared out of his wits, fearing that there would be a backlash against him for being complicit in this coup attempt. So he fled to Baghdad and then to Rome. But the CIA had not given up, and they tried again on August 19, 1953, and this time they succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested, the Shah promptly returned, and the British were back in control of their oil. Mossadegh was convicted of treason, placed in solitary confinement for 3 years, followed by house arrest for the remainder of his life. During his trial in a military court, Mossadegh pronounced, "Yes, my sin, my greater sin, and even my greatest sin is that I nationalized Iran's oil industry and discarded the system of political and economic exploitation by the world's greatest empire." And he continued with, "I fought this savage and dreadful system of international espionage and colonialism." And in my opinion, this blatant toppling of an elected government by a foreign power laid the groundwork for a massive political upheaval 26 years later. Now, assured of the backing of Great Britain and the United States, the Shah started consolidating his power. And to please the Western powers, the Shah reversed the nationalization of oil, signing a 25-year agreement with an international consortium which was 40% US owned. And following this, the SAVAK was established in 1957. The SAVAK, which was the centralized secret police and intelligence agency set up to combat internal dissent and foreign threats. It was set up with the assistance of the CIA and Israel's Mossad, and its primary purpose was to spy on Iranians. And with the SAVAK coming to the fore, Iran essentially became a surveillance state. Brutal torture methods like electric shocks, whippings, extrajudicial executions became synonymous with the SAVAK, and by the mid-1970s, it was estimated that there were between 25,000 and 100,000 political prisoners in Iran. In 1974, Amnesty International reported that no country in the world had a worse human rights record than Iran. With political dissent quelled, the Shah launched a massive program of reforms in 1963 called the White Revolution. The White Revolution included programs aimed at land reform, women empowerment and suffrage, and economic modernization. Under the land reform, the landed minority was forced to give up ownership of vast tracts of land for redistribution to small-scale cultivators. The former landlords were compensated for the loss of their land in the form of shares of state-owned Iranian industries. And cultivators and workers were also given a share in industrial and agricultural profits, and cooperatives began to replace the large landowners in rural areas. So essentially, with land reform, the Shah ended up redistributing wealth and creating new sources of income for the poorer sections of society. Iranian women were granted the right to vote, and the minimum legal marriage age was raised to 18 years. The laws were made more favorable to women with respect to divorce and child custody matters. And it was this empowerment of women that raised the alarm bells within the Iranian clergy, particularly their Grand Master, Ayatollah Khomeini. On the 3rd of June 1963, Ayatollah Khomeini delivered a sermon at the Feyziya school in Qom, where he denounced the Shah, comparing him to a tyrant and criticizing the reforms for their secular orientation. Secular orientation, according to him, meant alignment with the West. The Shah was not too concerned, and 2 days later had Khomeini arrested by the security forces. This sparked protests across Iran in Qom, Tehran, Mashhad, and Shiraz, and the government responded with force. Troops, tanks, and shoot-at-sight orders were used to suppress the demonstrations. Now, from the public point of view, the core issue was not the reforms. The core issue was the suppression of freedom and political participation for the general population, including the educated youth. And then, in October of 1964, the capitulation law was passed, a law that granted legal immunity to American military personnel and their families for any crimes committed on Iranian soil. And without doubt, this sparked a massive outrage. And Ayatollah Khomeini, who had by now been released, delivered a historic speech on October 26, 1964, declaring the law a shame and an act of servitude to the United States. This time, Khomeini was exiled, and he spent 14 years in exile, starting with Turkey, then to Iraq in 1965, and finally to France in 1978. But by banishing Khomeini into exile, the Shah inadvertently gave the Iranians a political leader they could look up to, despite Khomeini's ultra-conservative stance. Many historians often state that the Shah's push for reforms at such a pace was partly the result of the birth of 2 sons from his third wife, Farah Diba, which assured him the continuation of the Pahlavi dynasty. Besides being an authoritarian, the Shah was also very ostentatious. On October 26, 1967, the Shah crowned himself the Emperor of Iran, or Shahanshah, that is the King of Kings, and he placed the crown on his own head, the Napoleon style. And Farah Diba was crowned Shah Banu, or Empress. So you have the general Iranian public trying to push for democratic reform, but the leader ends up crowning himself emperor. And while his critics were accusing him of this flagrant violation of the constitution, the Shah followed it up with a massive celebration in 1971, marking 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. Approximately $500 million in today's money was spent by the Shah, transforming the Persepolis Desert into a tent city, hosting 60+ dignitaries from across the globe. The transformation included 50 luxury air-conditioned tents designed by Janssen of Paris, 4 tons of food flown in from Paris's Maxime de Paris restaurant, and 15,000 trees and 15,000 bushes planted, imported from Versailles. The 5.5-hour lunch for 600 people was recorded as the longest and most lavish banquet in modern history. But where did Shah get all this money from? The short answer? Oil. In 1960, with the formation of OPEC, Iran became one of its founding members and saw a windfall with respect to oil revenues. Between 1963 and 1973, Iran's economy grew at the rate of 11% per year, thanks to the oil revenues. And as the price of oil quadrupled during the 1973 oil crisis, Iran witnessed a windfall, and the Shah purchased advanced weaponry worth billions of dollars from the US, making Iran the largest buyer of US arms in the 1970s. But in 1974, when he was 54, the Shah was diagnosed with cancer, specifically chronic lymphatic leukemia. His son was still a teenager, and the Shah feared that it would create a succession battle, encourage opposition, and possibly bring an end to the monarchy. So he hid this diagnosis from the general public. And as a result, he began to appear less and less in public. Now, discontent had been slowly brewing in Iran. Despite the windfall in the economy, there was a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. And a large section of the population began to feel that the economic boom had benefited only a few. And coupled with the Shah losing touch with the general public was this massive future shock. Future shock meaning the pace of change was so rapid that the Iranians found it difficult to absorb and assimilate. Now, all that was needed was a spark to trigger a flame across the country. And that spark was provided on January 6, 1978, when Iranian newspaper Etelat published a front-page editorial disparaging Ayatollah Khomeini, branding him an immoral, anti-Iranian figure. 3 days later, on January 9, the main bazaar in Qom closed in protest against the article, and several thousand protesters attacked symbols of the monarchy. Now, the fundamental problem with authoritarianism is the authoritarians use their unbridled power and lack of accountability to suppress any dissent. And that is exactly how the Shah responded to the protesters in Qom. The security forces killed at least 5 people, and that inflamed the region, and slowly the cycle of protests, repression, violence started spreading across Iran. On September 8, 1978, the regime imposed martial law. Troops opened fire against demonstrators in Tehran, killing hundreds. And weeks later, government workers began to strike. On October 31, oil workers went on strike, bringing the oil industry to a halt. And while in exile, Ayatollah Khomeini continued to demand the Shah's abdication. In December of 1978, US President Jimmy Carter, embarrassed at the civilian death toll of the protests in Iran, started pressuring the Shah to abdicate, stating that the will of the Iranians had to be respected. Ironically, just a year ago, President Carter had branded Iran an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. Subsequently, on January 16, 1979, the Shah and his family left Iran for Egypt, leaving the country in the hands of the Prime Minister, Shopur Bakhtiar. The ground had been laid for the return of Ayatollah Khomeini, but he hesitated because he was afraid the Iranian military, which was still under the command of US commanders, could target him on his return. So what did he do? On January 27, 1979, he contacted President Jimmy Carter. Ayatollah Khomeini suggested to President Jimmy Carter that if he could use his influence on the Iranian military to have them stand down when he returned to Iran, he would restore stability to Iran, protect American interests and citizens, and be a friend to America. Surprised? Me too. And the biggest surprise was that the Carter administration fell for it. The Iranian military was asked to stand down, and Ayatollah Khomeini arrived at Tehran's Mehrabad airport on February 1, 1979, to a massive welcome. Within a month, on March 7, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a decree which mandated that women could work in offices, but they had to be veiled. Ironically, the International Women's Day was a day later, and there were massive protests by women on that day, on March 8, 1979. But despite all this, on March 31, Iranians voted overwhelmingly, in fact, by a 98.2% vote to convert Iran into an Islamic republic. Whoa, 98.2%? Yes, and a lot of critics did point out that that number seemed very, very suspect. There were a lot of irregularities with respect to procedures, ballots, and intimidation, but a big majority had indeed voted in favor of the Islamic Republic. The 98.2%, though, was questionable. The Shah, meanwhile, wandered through several countries, including Egypt, Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico, because countries were reluctant to admit him for fear of provoking the new Islamist regime. The United States, too, initially refused him entry. But two individuals, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, David Rockefeller, lobbied the Carter administration to allow the Shah to come to the United States for treatment of his lymphatic cancer. Henry Kissinger backed the Shah because he felt that the US needed to support their long-term ally, and David Rockefeller lobbied because Chase Manhattan had been managing the Shah's personal fortune. The Carter administration agreed, and the Shah entered the United States on October 22, 1979. This led to a massive outcry among the fundamentalists within Iran, and on November 4, 1979, student protesters overran the US embassy in Tehran, seizing its personnel as hostages. This ultimately led to the hostage crisis, which lasted 444 days till the new President Ronald Reagan was sworn into office on January 20, 1981. The Shah left the United States for Panama on December 15, 1979. Finally, Egypt's Anwar Sadat overcame stiff opposition and allowed the Shah to come to Egypt for his final days. Subsequently, the Shah landed once again in Egypt in March of 1980 and died a few months later on July the 27th. He was buried in Cairo. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Why did Winston Churchill continue to call Iran Persia during World War II? Since Iran sounded very much like its neighbor Iraq, Churchill did not want to create any confusion with respect to military orders during World War II. So the answer is D. Question for the current episode. Which political leader within the Middle East region offered to assassinate Ayatollah Khomeini while he was in exile? Was it A, Egypt's Anwar Sadat, B, Israel's Menachem Begin, C, Iraq's Saddam Hussein, or D, Jordan's King Hussein? Once again, which political leader within the Middle East region offered to assassinate Ayatollah Khomeini while he was in exile? Was it A, Egypt's Anwar Sadat, B, Israel's Menachem Begin, C, Iraq's Saddam Hussein, or D, Jordan's King Hussein? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll meet again in 2 weeks with another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.